Hello, and welcome to the final episode of Season 8 of Bad Gays, a podcast about evil and complicated queers in history. My name is Ben Miller. I'm a writer and historian working on a biography of the fashion designer Rudy Gernrich.
And my name's Hugh Lemmy. I'm a writer and author.
And it's the last episode of the season, which means we have now made 90 hours of this show.
Whew.
90 hours.
It's been a good season, I think.
It's been a very good season.
I hope you've enjoyed it as listeners.
And we've enjoyed making it, which means I think we're not done yet. So there will be a season 9, and there will, of course, be specials, and there will, of course, be extra Bad Gays every month for our wonderful subscribers. But before you can move on with your lives and we can move on with our lives, we have to make the 90th hour of this goddamn show. So last week, we talked about the Bavarian swindler Adela Spitzeder. Who are we talking about this week, Hugh?
Well, let me start with a little story, Ben. So last year, I spent about 2 months walking across the Iberian Peninsula from Catalonia to Galicia. And about a week into the walk, I walked over the border from Catalonia into the neighbouring autonomous community of Aragon. So the weather was very hot. I was still hiking in that Mediterranean biome, and the earth was dusty as I walked these long days through this arid farmland, these long flat tracks that form the medieval pilgrim's trail as it enters the Hoya de Huesca, a plateau of agricultural land that runs right up to the foothills of the Pyrenees. And in the distance, I could see atop this rocky outcrop an enormous fortress. It was striking. It had these huge defensive walls that ran all the way along the escarpment in this sandy stone, and it commanded a view right across the plain. It was the castle of Monzon, which is a small town that is clustered around its base, and the next day I took a rest day in the town. And after a lie, I walked up to the gatehouse of the castle to see what its story was. And on the sign at the entrance was a very unusual crest, a seal, which I had seen before. And it can be found at sites across Europe in the Mediterranean basin, from Tomar in Portugal to Shafiq Arnoun in Lebanon, from Cyprus to Scotland, Ireland, Germany, Slovenia, Poland. So the seal has 2 sides. On the reverse of the seal is the Dome of the Rock, the shrine at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. And on the obverse is an unusual image. It's 2 knights riding on the back of 1 horse. And the legend of the seal says in Latin, Sigillum Militum, which means the seal of the soldiers. And on the obverse, Christi de Templo, Christ of the Temple. So it was the seal of the Grand Masters of the Templars, a medieval religious order of warrior monks almost, that grew during the Crusades from being a handful of knights upon its foundation in 1119 to becoming one of the most powerful organizations in the world some 200 years later, and what some people have called the world's first multinational corporation. It had almost 1,000 castles and military outposts across Europe and the Middle East. So today's subject is Jacques de Molay. He was the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, or to give them their full title, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon.
Seems like they maybe weren't so poor.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting story, how it goes from being this story of an order of poverty to one of the richest organizations in the world. But Ben, when I say to you the words the Knights Templar, what sort of thing springs to mind?
It's funny, I know very little about the Knights Templar. Very little. But I have this vague association with a kind of Catholic-y conspiracy theory kind of stuff, the Da Vinci Code, that kind of thing. I'm sorry for bringing that unbelievably terrible novel into the conversation.
No, ever since their dissolution, the Knights Templar have been associated with all sorts of apparent manifestations of like occultism, of shadowy transnational powerbrokers, of the guardians of the Holy Grail.
Is the Illuminati myth somehow linked to them?
Yeah, it's like a similar sort of vibe, at least.
Yeah.
I think all these sort of conspiracies, if you dig deep enough, become linked to each other at some point. They also appear, of course, in lots of pop cultural forms. They're in Indiana Jones. They're in National Treasure, the film, right through to like Assassin's Creed, Final Fantasy, stuff like that. And their name has been appropriated over the centuries by all sorts of other organizations, from the Freemasons to, at the moment, various sort of fascist crackpots. The anti-alcohol temperance movement in the 19th century liked to associate itself with the Templars, And there are now various neo-Templar organizations in the world that have sprung up since the start of the 19th century. Perhaps most famous or infamous is the association of the Knights Templar with a dark secret society that has, since the time of Christ, preserved some sort of secret hidden knowledge, perhaps regarding the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail or even Christ's bloodliners. You mentioned we've been unfortunate enough to read in Dan Brown's Potboiler, The Da Vinci Code.
I remember in that book, there is a phrase, quote, half-eaten power lunch, end quotes. And that is a phrase that will just stick in my mind forever as an example of what happens when writing goes wrong. But whatever, we can all laugh at Dan Brown and he gets to sit in his very big house.
Yes. We're going to steer away from those sort of fantastical theories or the reality of the Templars
I
today.
want to have fun. It's the last episode of the season, Hugh. Let's do some wild conspiracy theory.
We will be doing some wild conspiracy theory.
And I'm done with historical research. We make the wrong kind of podcast. We sit and we write these long episodes. We should have one of these podcasts where we just talk completely out of nowhere and just say wild things.
About zeitgeist and stuff.
Exactly. No, about like various conspiracies, and then we build a group of followers who think they can only trust us, and then they give us more and more of their money. And this is really, all of this good practice stuff is really getting on me at this point. I don't know why we bother.
We can talk about it because conspiracy is actually a big part of the real life history of the Templars, so that'll come up in a bit. And it's also, I think, worth mentioning because the persistence of the idea of the Templars as a sort of secretive, shadowy underground organization of these high-achieving spiritual warriors actually has a good deal to do with how the organization evolved and finally met its end under today's subject, Jacques de Molay. So we'll start with Jacques. We know actually very little about Jacques' early life at all, to be honest, and why would we? Like, he came from a pretty minor noble family, probably from the commune of Molay in Burgundy, which at the time when he was born in 1244 was part of the Holy Roman Empire.
Did they still make delicious wine?
Did they make delicious... Oh, in Burgundy.
Did they still back then make delicious wine?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the Templars were part of that process, in fact. It's a sign of what the Templars had become that someone who did come from this very minor family could rise to that sort of position. The Europe that he was born into was a deeply pious one, and one that for the previous 150 years had been taken over with the spirit of the Crusaders. The Crusades were a series of religious wars that had taken place with incursions and invasions by Christian Europeans into Muslim-held territories in what they called the Holy Land in Palestine. The Crusades were a sort of combination of military campaign and religious pilgrimage, an act of repentance and a holy war. And while the original objective was to take control of Jerusalem out of non-Christian hands, there was significant mission creep as it evolved, and it soon became clear that to hold Jerusalem, other lands had to be captured and defended and administered. And so there was this establishment of Christian castles and counties and even kingdoms in the Middle East. In the wake of the conquests, and while the constant wars against Muslims who were trying to reconquer their territory were still waging, the Crusaders found in their wake thousands upon thousands of European pilgrims, from the most humble people to the most noble, were wanting to visit Jerusalem and see for themselves the sights from the life of their own God. There's multiple ways of defining and thinking about what the Crusades were. In the traditional view, there were these big 8 major crusades and this handful of minor ones, which were military campaigns in the Holy Land that were either called for or condoned by various popes, and it ran from 1095 to 1291. But there's other ways of thinking about the Crusades as a sort of series of conflicts that ran for over 500 years, which were mass mobilizations against non-Christians and heretics, motivated by religious fervor. And so looking at it through this lens, we see, for example, there's many popular crusades, unofficial ones not called by the church, but rather through the piety of the believers in Christendom. For example, the Shepherd's Crusade, the Crusade of the Poor, the People's Crusade. And these weren't always aimed at the Holy Land. Some became sweeping pogroms aimed at killing or expelling Jews from Europe, for example. And there were crusades against heresy within Europe as well, such as the Albigensian Crusade and the Bosnian and Bohemian Crusades, which were military campaigns within Europe to kill and suppress religious practices. For example, the Albigensian Crusade, those are the Cathars. And in fact, some people even regard the Reconquista, which was the conquest or reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim control that took place over 700 years from the 8th to the 15th century as part of this same movement, I think with good reason. And in fact, the castle I saw at Monzon on my own pilgrimage was originally built by Muslims in Al-Andalus before being captured by Sancho Ramirez, who was the king of Aragon. And it found itself on the front line between these Christian kingdoms of the north and Muslim Caliphate of Cordoba in the south. So it's a sort of spreading religious culture of military campaigns against various forms of pagans, heretics, Muslims, etc., etc. So this was Jacques' 13th century world. It was one of actually great dynamism and also great brutality. And it was driven by a deep spiritual and ideological belief. You can really only imagine the depth of religious fervour that you'd need to drive thousands of shoeless, weaponless, foodless peasants to try and walk across medieval Europe to get to Jerusalem in order to wage a war against an unknown enemy. And that spiritual piety is counterbalanced by a deeply political and worldly Catholic polity. So this balance between the spiritual and the worldly was in fact the spark for the Crusades itself.
It sounds a lot like right populism throughout history. Like it's almost a prelude or maybe a birth of right populism in the Western world. We see this technique all the time. This is the technique. Worldly polity inspires fervor in less worldly mass population. Hate crimes ensue. Worldly polity slightly washes its hands of hate crimes.
Yeah, and at times worldly polity
loses control
of the forces that it unleashes for its own sake.
Gee, it sure would be a problem if they hadn't learned to stop doing this.
So in the 11th century, there was this great inversion in the way that Christendom was being run. For centuries under the Carolingian dynasty, the church had been subject to the secular power. So the church was under the authority of whatever king or emperor was deciding the laws in whatever place. And the church in that way was very deeply enmeshed in secular life. It was an extremely decentralized institution at this point. The Pope had been the Bishop of Rome, but he didn't appoint the other bishops, for example. They were appointed by the secular rulers. And many within the church began to see this as a source of great corruption. One of the biggest was simony, the selling of church offices. This great reform movement began that led to the Gregorian reforms, which turned this situation on its head. This meant that now the Pope became the highest authority in Christendom, as God had commanded. And as such, he was like the highest court in the land, and the disputes of the various kings would be referred to him. And he would be the ecclesiastical head of the church too, choosing its priesthood, rather than the secular powers doing it. Control of church property would also be returned to the church. And then finally, importantly, priests would no longer be allowed to fuck. No more clerical marriage, etc. So this rejuvenated church under a new ecclesiastical and political order was full of a new vigour. And it now understood that rather than being a sort of spiritual guide to these great rulers and armies, it was a great ruler in itself, with the armies of the kings and the noblemen at its own disposal for religious ends.
Yes, for religious ends.
I do actually think for religious ends. That's the thing you have to balance with this, is you can have a useful cynicism about it, but also true piety is a big driver of these things. But then what was in it for the nobles to spend these huge amounts of time and money moving your armies across the Mediterranean in order to besiege the Muslim lands of the East? The church then offered the most valuable thing they could as God's representatives on earth, which is the forgiveness of sin. So to take part in a crusade would relieve the nobleman or the lowliest soldier of his obligation to do penance for his sins. It was in effect an armed pilgrimage. And on top of this, the Pope also promised to maintain order at home, so while you were gone, he would guarantee the safety of your property and your family. And it's worth remembering here that, of course, Europe was largely, if not entirely, a feudal system. You owed labour to your lord, whether that's agricultural labour or military labour, for the right to work on the land. And then your lord owed military services of his men to higher noble, and that goes all the way up the chain. But the kings didn't owe military support to the Pope in that way. But it did make sense for them to provide it to him, not just for spiritual reasons, but for practical ones, because now he was the great arbiter of power in Europe. And for the Pope, there was a secular as well as spiritual reason for the Crusades, because rather than having these huge quantities of armed nobles in Europe would be destructively fighting each other for power and control, why not unite them and send them overseas to gain more wealth for Christendom? So in 1095, this issue came to a head. The Seljuk Turks had been encroaching towards Constantinople, which was Christian, but at that point was just part of the Eastern Church. because 50 years earlier, the Eastern Church and the Western Church had split apart in this thing called the Great Schism. And so the Pope Urban II, wondered if maybe a crusade might actually help to reunite these two churches.
It did not.
Yeah, spoiler alert, it did not. But it went some way towards it. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexius I Komnenos, he asked Urban for help. And what's more, the Seljuk Turks, who were obviously Muslims, were harassing pilgrims who were visiting the Holy Land. And so that's when he declared the First Crusade.
My son Sebastian was a great fan of the Byzantine. Are you a fan of the Byzantine, Dr. Kukrowicz? Suddenly last summer, Katharine Hepburn descending in a giant cage elevator in a white gown. Anyway, continue.
So as a measure of its popularity, actually, there was a people's crusade of poor peasants that actually left Europe months before the official crusade of nobles had got their act together, although they never actually made it all the way to Jerusalem. After marauding their way across Europe, perpetrating pogroms as they went, they finally arrived in Constantinople, and then they headed out of Byzantine territory into Seljuk territory, and there they were unceremoniously slaughtered by this massively superior military force.
Can I say something potentially controversial? Fuck around and find out.
It was a fuck around and find out situation. Yeah, they left only a couple of hundred stragglers to make their way to Jerusalem and wait for the noble Princes' Crusade to arrive. But the princes followed, and they were considerably better organized. And we're talking like a huge number of people here. Like towards the higher estimates, you're looking at maybe 10,000 knights, 50,000 soldiers, and up to 100,000 non-combatants, men, women, and children. And this is at a time when the population of most major European cities was barely scraping 10,000 people. The population of England was probably, 1.5, 2 million people, maybe less. And you're taking 100,000, 200,000 people on a crusade? It's a massive undertaking.
A tenth of the population of England went on a given crusade?
No. These were crusaders from across Europe.
They come from all over Europe.
I'm just saying as a comparison.
But it's the equivalent of the tenth of the population of England. Okay, that makes sense.
If there was a crusade today and they in Europe pulled together 6 or 7 million people to go. So as the Crusades...
Don't give them any ideas. Ursula von der Leyen, if you are listening, no, I won't go.
So as the Crusades continued, this new infrastructure sprang up to help sustain them and to consolidate their territorial gains. So some European sea republics developed these large navies that helped transport soldiers and materiel, for example. But within the Crusader states themselves, and the Crusader states were these polities that emerged to manage the Holy Land. They were collectively known as Outremer, which means like over the sea in French. But they were the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. And within those states, a new form of military infrastructure started to emerge, which were the military orders. So military orders were comprised of laymen who took religious vows to follow certain rules, like monks do. So there was the Knights Hospitaller, the Order of the Holy Sepulchre, the Order of St. Lazarus, and so on. And the most powerful of these orders was to be the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar. So the Knights Templar were formed by a crusading knight called Hugh of Paynes.
So that's you after sitting in the chair these weeks and writing all these episodes? He's been on a lot of my ibuprofen.
That's always me.
My couch is not that comfortable. This reminds me of my favorite ever joke on 30 Rock, which is that Jack Donaghy's mother goes to a Catholic church in Waltham called Our Lady of the Reluctant Integrations.
In 1119, some 25 years after the First Crusade was called, Hugh was living in Jerusalem, now under Christian control, and he lived around the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the site where Christ was supposedly said to have been resurrected from, buried and resurrected. And he was looking for a place for himself in Crusader society. And he very much admired the lives of the monks around whom he lived. They lived their lives according to these strict religious rules, which were like sets of precepts laid down, which dictated like almost every aspect of their religious life. From when they got up to pray in the morning, how their monasteries and collective life were ordered as a sort of community, what to wear, how to organize things, what to eat. And he wondered whether such a rule for knights might help actually produce a more holy form of religious warfare, in much the same way as the Knights Hospitaller had taken a religious rule as well, and they'd established medical care for pilgrims by an order of laymen in the region. And so this small group, like maybe even just maybe 9 or 10 knights, came together to form the Templars, and they adopted poverty, obedience, and chastity as their way of life. And they devoted themselves specifically to protecting pilgrims who would come to visit the holy places from being attacked on the roads. According to the chronicler, William of Tyre, their pledge, quote, was that as far as their strength permitted, they should keep the roads and highways safe from the menace of robbers and highwaymen, with a special regard for the protection of pilgrims, end quote. And so with the cheerleader of the Crusaders, the abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, they then worked out their own specific rule, which was called the Latin rule, by which they lived. So here's some of the aspects of their life. I wonder whether you could deal with it, Ben. They were to wear a white tunic with a red cross at all times. They ate meat only 3 times a week. They ate in silence. They held no private possessions. They slept together in a shared dormitory, a single shared dormitory. They were allowed no contact with women. In general, only unmarried men actually could join. And they would remain members for their whole life unless they got special dispensation. And they would live a life of poverty, surviving only on the charity of other Christians.
Does not sound ideal, but what are the sorts of things, Hugh, that we think motivate people to join organizations like this at this time? For convents, it's easy to imagine that if you're some nobleman's daughter and you would rather not get married off at 14 and have to have 47 children without an epidural, you would actually be okay with getting to go and live someplace with some other women and read quietly for your life. But what are the things that push men to join?
Religious reasons. And I think also as the time progresses, self-defense as well. They become a very effective fighting force. You're well supplied through the charity of others with a lot of resources and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe for some also sleeping together in a big shared dormitory. Sounds hot.
No contact with women. Oh, no.
And in fact, their emblem, which is the 2 men riding 1 horse, it sounds like...
I bet they are.
It's a little bit Brokeback Mountain to us. But
I believe you mean Bareback Mountain.
But actually, it symbolized their vow of poverty, that they could only afford 1 horse for each 2 knights. Not actually the case. They ended up becoming extremely well supplied.
Oh, yeah, sure, buddy. Ride the horse with me. We can only afford 1 in the city.
So that castle I visited actually at Monzon, which was gifted to the Knights Templar in 1143 and been rebuilt extensively by them. The architecture of it really reflects this rule because the fortifications are vast, but the buildings of the castle were very simple. I saw the dormitory in which the men slept, the refectory in which they ate, the church in which they prayed, and the keep in which they fought, and that was the extent of their lives. So they started off with a few small apartments in the Al-Aqsa Mosque on Temple Mount, which had been deconsecrated, and which was thought to be where the Temple of Solomon stood. And that's where they got their name from and the seal. But it very quickly achieved rapid growth, and the order was successful beyond their wildest dreams. According to historian Malcolm Barber, quote, although there are a few voices raised in protest at the sight of this strange hybrid, the monastic knight, the concept rapidly captured the imagination of the military classes, from which were drawn the material donations and recruits, which form the core of the hundreds of preceptories established in the West from the 1130s onwards, end quote. The blessing and propaganda of Bernard of Clairvaux also swelled their ranks. He wrote, quote, with what glory the victors return from the battle, with what sanctity the martyrs die in the battle, end quote. But as they grew, this simple task of protecting pilgrims expanded to pitched warfare, organised battles against the Muslims. And with their well-funded, disciplined, highly trained knights, they became an absolutely formidable military opponent, the sort of Marine Corps of the Crusaders. And they were often sent in first to deliver a decisive hammer blow to the enemy. They achieved many notable victories, including at the Battle of Montgessard, where a vastly outnumbered Crusader force, led by the Templar Knights, actually managed to rout Saladin and they smashed his army. And so their reputation was fierce. An English Crusader actually at the time would write about the death of their Grand Master in battle in 1189. Quote, it is a happy man on whom the Lord confers such glory as the crown of laurel, which he had merited in so many wars, for he gained admission to the College of Martyrs. When he saw the slaughter of his men on all sides, and was encouraged by those around him to flee so that he would not perish, he said, God forbid that I would act in a manner which would bring shame and scandal on the Templars. For if I fled, it would be said that I had saved my life and left my fellow knights to die. He would indeed have escaped if he had wished, but he was cut down and died with the others who were cut down." End quote. But the organisation was also growing outside of its military role, and this took many fronts, mainly economic, and it was helped by one main benefit. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a papal bull called Omnidatum Optimum, which means every perfect gift. And every perfect gift it certainly was, because it allowed them to keep everything that they'd looted from the Muslims. It also allowed them to build churches, castles, cemeteries, things like that. And so they became landowners. And it allowed them to appoint and expel members, but most importantly, it relieved them of the obligation to pay any local taxes anywhere. No tithes, no tributes, and it also exempted them from following any local laws or external controls, either secular or from the local clergy. They were answerable only to the Pope. So a tax-free transnational organisation that's allowed to accrue property and wealth and is exempt from any local restrictions is a recipe for success, and the Templars already managed it. They combined this pillaged wealth from the Muslims with enormous donations from wealthy nobles, as well as receiving all the land and property and livestock and even tenants of any nobleman who joined the order. They even had the right to levy taxes and tolls on things like markets in the areas they controlled, which is obviously a huge boon in medieval Europe. And so this vast wealth they then invested, and they created an enormous property portfolio across Europe. They built not just castles and commanderies, but churches, preceptories, manor houses, estates, vineyards. They even branched out into manufacturing. They built ships and shipyards.
We're a long way from sleeping together in one dorm and being so poor we can only afford one horse.
Yeah, this is the wealth that's held in common by the organisation, which somehow pretends that frees them to live in poverty. This vast international network then allowed them to pioneer an even more profitable strategy, which was financial instruments.
So, oh my God, they really got there, didn't they?
They got there, yeah. So their original mission statement was, of course, to protect the pilgrims who were travelling to the Holy Land. And one of the biggest threats to pilgrims, and what made them the biggest targets, was that to travel over a number of months across land and sea to Palestine, they needed money. And so banditry was rife as people preyed on these quite often quite large and wealthy groups of pilgrims in areas where the Templar military couldn't actually reach. And perhaps, of course, like in taverns and hostels and whatnot, in which they were eating and sleeping. The Templars devised a new system. You'd take your pilgrim savings to a Templar institution, say the Temple Church off Fleet Street in London, which is still standing. It was built by the Templars in the 12th century. And then you'd give them your money, and they would write you, in essence, a credit note in a secret code, which you'd then take with you. And then when you make landfall in France and your little purse of gold was looking empty, you then take your note to the Templar castle in the local town where you were staying, and then they'd give you some gold, and then a new note with your new balance. And so this way you could travel across Europe, making withdrawals without ever carrying this huge amount of gold coin yourself.
The traveler's checks.
Traveler's checks, yeah. They'd invented, in effect, the bank. This is the first modern sort of form of banking, especially in Europe. And this wasn't just useful for pilgrims, but it also then provided them with this huge amount of reserve capital, which they then branched out into producing other financial instruments. Even though money lending was forbidden by the church, these huge reserves meant that rather than loaning you money to buy a property, for example, the church would simply buy the property itself and then you'd pay them back as rent. So they found all these loopholes for getting away, administration fees and all these other loopholes that would get away with them not charging interest. They'd also broker deals like land sales because they'd be trusted as guarantors due to their vast wealth. They would negotiate currency exchanges, which were obviously always in their favour. They would pawn people's goods, including at one point even the crown jewels of England were held by the Templars as a collateral. And they would also finance wars, crusades, and building projects. They would even act as the executor for wills and for establishment of foundations after people's death. So it was this astonishing network that crossed all of Europe and of course led to this huge prosperity. And it necessitated a massive infrastructure to run all these businesses in the West. At its height, it's thought that there were maybe 20,000 members of the order, but only 10% of those were actually involved in warfare as knights. And actually probably about 2/3 of the order weren't even in the Holy Land. They were in Europe administering this huge system that supported the knights in their incredibly expensive, loss-making campaigns. It has a huge loss of life. And also, of course, they were dedicated to the continuation and the perpetuation of their own bureaucratic structure.
That's what happens when you build institutions.
The organization was huge, like knights, nobles, kings, even the Pope himself at one point took advantage of this new banking system. But unsurprisingly, it was also the thing that would then come to doom the Templars, this temporal power. And this is where we come back to Jacques de Molay himself. But by the end of the 13th century, things had begun to look really bad for the Crusades in general. It wasn't necessarily a cause of panic. Like already in the late 12th century, things had looked bad. With Saladin, he'd made these huge gains, the Muslim leader. He made these huge gains and recaptured Jerusalem. But then the English king, Richard de Lionheart, who was a strong ally of the Templars, managed a sort of astonishing rally of the troops to recapture the lost territory. And so because they had been so involved in recapturing this territory, they were actually at their height in the 13th century. But gradually, Christians' fortunes in the Middle East had failed them. And in 1291, after a prolonged siege of their headquarters in Acre, the Templars were actually forced to relocate onto the island of Cyprus. And they made these attempts to regain a foothold, a bridgehead in the Holy Land, but they all failed. So now you have this very difficult situation because the raison d'etre of the Templars had been to defend pilgrims to the Holy Land, but now they couldn't actually do that. But they just had this, they were just the rest of the corporation, this big network of financial power. And the power obviously made them loads of enemies over the decades. And while they were in the Holy Land, that could be managed because they were still a powerful military force doing the Lord's work on behalf of the Pope. But now they were just this bunch of rich tax-evading bankers
In Cyprus.
with living offshore with loads of clients who owed them loads of money. It was a year after the Siege of Acre that Jacques actually took the office of Grand Master, the highest office in the Templars, in the middle of this political crisis. And he'd been serving as a Knight Templar and eating in their refectories and sleeping in their shared dormitories for over 35 years at this point. So he was a veteran, but his biggest battle, which was to come, which was to take on this new political threat. Meanwhile, the dissent within the church was being aimed at the Templars. It was like being claimed that they weren't capable of reforming themselves, like most of the other religious orders periodically reformed themselves, that they weren't really capable of doing it because of their wealth. Jacques de Molay tried to revive the order by suggesting the need for one last big push, a troop surge, a new invasion. Quote, "A small-scale expedition would be ineffectual, causing harm and ignominy to Christendom," he then claimed. He recommended a large invasion involving, quote, "the Lord Kings of France, England, Germany, Sicily, Spain, and the other lords of the land, great and small, whose hearts God might illuminate in the affair so pious and laudable," end quote. The Pope didn't think this was such a good idea. He suggested to Molay that a solution to this organizational ennui, the rivalry between these different orders especially, was to amalgamate them so that the Templars should be merged with the Hospitallers. But Molay thought it was a really bad idea. Ramon Llull, who was a Catalan writer and theologian, he recommended it, saying, quote, "All the orders of knighthood should welcome this step, and should anyone oppose it, he would be seen to be neither faithful nor devout, and he should consider the judgment on the last day, when the Lord Jesus Christ says, 'Depart into everlasting fire, you accursed ones.'" As the historian Dan Jones remarks in his History of the Crusades, quote, "His words would prove darkly prophetic." In 1306, he returns to Europe from the Holy Land to meet the new Pope in Avignon, which was at that point the seat of the papacy, and to make his case. The Pope was Clement V, who was a Frenchman who had ascended to the throne largely thanks to the machinations of Philip IV of France, who was this vicious, paranoid ruler. He really feared challenges to his power from anywhere. And he'd suppressed the power of his own nobility and begun the sort of slow steps to centralise power in France away from the feudal lords. But he hadn't yet acted to check the power of his organisation, to whom he owed a huge amount of money, the Templars. They had funded his war in France, and he resented not just his debts to them, but also the power and influence that they had within France, due to those enormous holdings they had, and also, of course, their exemption from his laws. It's what kind of been called like a state within a state. A few years previously, accusations of heresy had begun to be circulated about the Templar order, and so Philip leapt on this as his chance to free himself of his debts. He ordered dawn raids across France of hundreds of Templars, including the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. The charges against the Templars are colourful, to say the least. The initiation ceremony of the order had always been shrouded in secrecy for outsiders, which of course added to suspicion of it. And now with Philip's prosecutors, they could reveal really what went on behind the scenes. The initiation started, they claimed, with the repeated denial of Christ. They didn't say confession to a priest, but instead to a master of the order, which was heretical. And then also the master of the order and not a priest could also forgive them of their sins. So it's almost like they were a state within the church. They worshipped a statue of a bearded man's head, which they claimed held great powers. And then they took their cocks out and they pissed on the crucifix. And then at the end of this secret ceremony, they kissed. And then they kissed their navel, their belly button. And then they rimmed each other. And then they performed all sorts of other sodomistical acts.
Now that you were asking what part of this sounded fun to me, that's the part that sounds fun to me. Were they doing that somewhere in town tonight? We should go check it out.
Yeah, I think I've been to this.
Are they recruiting?
We should start a Templar bar.
Templar night at Laboratory.
A writer at the time describes it thus, quote, "My heart is depressed and shudders because they have been bound to the enemy for so long. They were all infected by it. It's more than 100 years since their mischief first appeared. Between them they have made an order which is so foul, vile, and horrible that it's hideous to speak about it. As soon as they received someone into their order, they made him deny God and despise Jesus Christ and the cross, commanding him to spit on it. They kissed each other's buttocks. They did many things. Alas, it is a shame that they were ever born of Adam, because they will all be condemned and scattered and destroyed. Alas." Within days, many of the arrested Templars confessed, including Jacques de Molay, after these barbaric tortures in which they were made to recall this dark mass at this initiation ceremony. A contemporary chronicler wrote, quote, "What is more, if they do not say these things, not only before but even after torture, they are always held in dark prison cells, with only the bread of sorrow and the water of affliction, in winter time with the pressing cold, lying with sighs and grief on the ground without straw or coverings. In the middle of the nights, to increase their terror, now one, now another is taken from cell to cell. Those whom they have killed in torture, they secretly bury in the stable or in the garden, for fear that such horrible and savage deeds should reach the royal ears. They had told and tell that the aforesaid brothers did not confess their crimes by violence, but of their own accord."
I see.
So Jack was made to write out a letter demanding that all his fellow brothers admit to this heresy and this orgiastic initiation ritual, and he did. But Philip had actually seriously stepped across the line with the Pope, because he was a habitual line stepper. The Templars were answerable only to the Pope, not to the King of France, and so the Pope demanded to see Jack himself. And stood before the cardinals, Jack renounced his confession that was induced through torture. Yet there was another interrogation also in front of the cardinals, but this time with agents of the king present, and he confessed to it again. In the trials, accusations of homosexuality were foregrounded, so many of the brothers confessed, quote unquote, to a culture which allowed, if not encouraged, sodomy between brothers. And the kissing on the ass and the stomach was very symbolic, because it was seen as this perversion of the kiss on the lips, which was a normal rite of entry into any military order. So to then go to kissing on the ass was like to make a mockery of the whole thing. And the Pope decided, therefore, that the Templar masters, at least, should be tried by the church and not by the king. The trials of the Templars continued for 4 years or more, during which time many had already been burnt to the stake by the king. But Clement IV, pressured by King Philip, finally issued an edict suppressing the Templars in 1312, and the organisation began to be dismantled across Europe. Finally, Jacques and his fellow Templar leaders are brought before the Court of Cardinals to finally be sentenced to life imprisonment for their crime. But here the historian Henry Charles Lee takes up the story. Quote, "The affair was supposed to be concluded when, to the dismay of the prelates and the wonderment of the assembled crowd, Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny arose. They had been guilty, they said, not of the crimes imputed to them, but of basely betraying their order to save their own lives. It was pure and holy. The charges were fictitious and the confessions false. Hastily, the cardinals delivered them to the prelate of Paris and retired to deliberate on this unexpected contingency. But they were saved all trouble. When the news was carried to Philip, he was furious. A short consultation with his council only was required. The canons pronounced that a relapsed heretic was to be burned without a hearing. The facts were notorious, and no forward judgment by the papal commission need be waited for." That same day, by sunset, a pyre was erected on a small island in the Seine, the Ile de Juif, near the palace garden. There, de Molay, de Charny, de Gonville, and de Perrot were slowly burned to death, refusing all offers of pardon for retraction, and bearing their torment with a composure which won for them the reputation of martyrs amongst the people, who reverently collected their ashes as relics." End quote. The assets of the Templars were divided up amongst the other military orders, but their archive, which included all the debts and all the financial transactions, was never found.
Imagine why.
Hi, you're listening to Bad Gays. We're an audience-supported show. We don't have a network, we don't have sponsors or advertising. It's really you guys who keep the show on the road. So if you're interested in supporting us, why not head over to Patreon, where you can listen to Extra Bad Gays, our monthly podcast about all things queer.
It's really fun to do. You get to hear from us every month. You get to hear from us in a less scripted format. We're starting to do fun new things like an advice column segment. Again, all of that is only for subscribers. You can also subscribe on Apple Podcasts right there in the app. We also have new merch for Season 8. We have t-shirts, we have socks that say Evil Twink Energy on them. We have caps in pink and camo and black. Go check it out, all at our website at badgayspod.com. All of that helps us keep the show going and do more of this, which we love to do.
And now, on with the show.
Thanks for that, Hugh. A very fascinating and disturbing story. I think disturbing mostly because of the echoes that still echo today. My first question is about these charges of homosexuality. I sense it in your telling, and am I wrong to sense that you understand and that historians understand these charges to have been like Henry VIII closing down the monasteries, where they're trumped up or invented or overhyped in order to then justify these attacks on an order which really have a different meaning? In Henry VIII's case, he wanted the land. In this King of France's case, he wanted more fully integrated control.
Yeah, I think that's a very good comparison, because they are trumped up charges, almost certainly, but they're trumped up in such a way as to have an element of truthiness about them. Partly because of, for the same reason as the Henry VIII and the monks, it's this issue of chastity, these male-only organizations that are supposedly chaste. I think one thing to mention is that sodomy at the time was like a standard part of any accusation of heresy. And in fact, sodomy was seen to be integral to heresy. You couldn't actually pull those two things apart. It's not that, oh, they're heretics and part of their heresy is they do sodomitical acts. Like all heresy was seen to involve sodomitical acts at the time. The Cathars are exactly the same. The nature of that sodomy changed according to the shape of the organization. And in this case, it's very clear. Standard disclaimer talking about sodomy in the Middle Ages. When church records talk about sodomy, they're talking about any sort of non-procreative sexual act. A man and a woman having oral sex is sodomy. In this situation, they're talking about sodomy as homosexuality because they're all men. So that's one aspect of that. But the reason I think, of course, that it was believable maybe at the time, or that it emerges, is because, of course, I'm sure there was loads of sodomy going on. Even within their order, they had all sorts of rules within the Latin rule. For example, here's one. They'll sleep at all times dressed in shirt and breeches and shoes and belts, and where they sleep shall be lit until morning. And they'll be lit so that the shadowy enemies may not lead them to wickedness, which God forbids them. Like, it really reminds me of a friend of mine talking about camping, staying at a friend's house, and how their friend would always put a gay barrier between them, a pillar as a gay barrier. You only need a gay barrier if you're gay. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The rules, they light the dormitory until morning to help preserve the chastity, because the implication is they need the help of the light to preserve the chastity.
Yeah.
And there's also within the trials that they'd been orchestrated to suggest that they did have sex within the order in order to preserve the public image of chastity. So it was saying they can't be trusted. They're going around saying, oh, we're so pure and chaste. But they're only doing that because they're all fucking each other. So yeah, I think that's what's going on here. And I think almost certainly over 2 centuries of thousands of men sleeping in dormitories together overnight and never having the knowledge of a woman, situational homosexuality is a really existing phenomenon.
It is. And also, when there starts to be a situation where there's some situational homosexuality, then people who might want to find their way to some homosexuality maybe try to get themselves in that situation. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. So do the conspiracy theories about the Templars begin with this series of trumped up charges where the organization is shut down? Or does it then start up later? Is it uninterrupted? What is the kind of history of that?
Yeah, it continues. It's continual. And for good reason, I think. They were a shadowy cabal of extremely rich, secretive, powerful, transnational people acting outside of the law. They are like a prototypical conspiracy in that way. And of course, it grips the public imagination. I think the other thing that grips public imagination is how quickly it was suppressed, that it was just shut down, the assets divided, etc., etc. Nothing really remains except for they've refounded a version of the order within Portugal in the aftermath, which continues to this day as a sort of order. But yeah, I think the fact that it was shut down so quickly is one of the reasons. Surely all that wealth and power just doesn't disappear overnight, especially when you consider of the, I don't know, perhaps 10 to 20,000 knights who were Templars at the time, only a small fraction are ever prosecuted for these crimes. What happens to them? And I think that's where the conspiracy starts to come from.
I think that brings our show to a close. But before we go, one last time for our season, I'd like to ask you, Jacques de Molay, bad gay, not bad gay, bad not gay, not bad?
You know what? I don't know. It's a fascinating story. I suspect probably not gay himself. All caveats included in that phrase. But I think it's a very interesting story about these sort of all-male military organizations and in that way.
Like, talk about gays in the military.
Yes. So I think that's so I reserve judgment on that. And in terms of bad, yes, bad to be part of one of these marauding Crusader forces. Not really good. Although unjustly accused and may have a sticky end.
So if people want to learn more about Jacques de Molay and the Templars, what are some of the sources that you used to create this episode?
First, I have to say, if you are interested in learning about the Templars as a real historical organization, do not just go straight to your local bookstore and pick out a book called The Templars, The True History or something like this. Because there's probably no subject in the Western canon about which more pseudo-history has been written than the Templars. So you really have to be careful about what you pick up. So
yeah, make sure the author has a doctorate in history and not in...
Yes. So instead, I would recommend you pick up A New Knighthood, A History of the Order of the Temple by Malcolm Barber, which I consulted for this. It's one of the most authoritative academic books on the subject, and he's a highly respected medievalist and one of the world's leading experts on the Templars. And if you're looking for a sort of piece of popular history, then Dan Jones's 2017 book, The Templars, The Rise and the Spectacular Fall of God's Holy Warriors, is also a engaging read, which I looked at. And also for wider context, I looked at his book, Crusaders, The Epic History of the Wars for the Holy Land. And lastly, I also want to give a shout out to an incredible book by Amin Maalouf. In the Anglo world and in Europe, we usually read the Crusades through the conceptual lens of its role in European history, even if in more recent years that lens is probably a lot more critical as to representations of Arabs and Muslims in European history. And I'm not saying that seeing the Crusades in the context of Europe, as I've discussed it today, is incorrect, of course, but it's just one way to look at it. And I say this a lot, but because I'm not a historian, much of my perception of history comes from popular histories that actually continue this practice and often still orientalize the Muslim world, even while they're trying to be aware of those prejudices. But a number of years ago, I read this book by Maalouf, who is a Lebanese author, called The Crusades Through Arab Eyes. And it's such an interest. It's one of those books where it just springs open a new part of your brain to look at it. And so seeing the Crusades as he examines them through Muslim and Arab sources is fascinating, because you see as it perhaps more likely was, which is these stinking barbarians arriving into this quite advanced, developed world of law and science and medicine with their big sticks ruining everything. And some of the stories of the sort of Arab perception of Crusaders are absolutely fascinating, including, the cannibalism that went on, all sorts of horrendous sort of behavior. So I'd really recommend that as a great book.
You're right, Hugh. That book is a great book and a great classic. And I highly recommend it. And I also highly recommend another book, not about the Crusades, by Maalouf, which is a historical novel called Leo Africanus, about the eponymous African traveler who traveled through Europe and the Muslim world around the time of the European Renaissance. The book places him with a lot of historical figures. I'm not sure if all these meetings are sustained in the factual record, but the book places him with 3 popes, with Suleiman the Magnificent, with Raphael. It's an amazing read, and I really highly recommend it if you like historical fiction. I don't like most historical fiction. I find a lot of historical fiction to be bad at being both, and this manages to be good at being both, which is a rare and lovely treat.
That's something we can talk about on the Bad Gaze Extra, historical fiction, good or bad.
Yes.
Because I have a different opinion, I think. Okay, that's all for this season. It's a wrap. Thank you so much for joining us. If you miss us in the interim between now and season 9, then do subscribe to Bad Gaze Extra over on Patreon. We have all sorts of great conversations about everything queer in culture, politics, what's going on in the world. And if you want to find me online, you can find me at hugh.substack.com.
And you can find me at benwritesthings.com and the username benwritesthings in all the usual places. And that's it. See you soon.
Bye.
Bad. 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 Bad.